Bronze Age fools and copper lights, chamber pots and Templar knights. Study, read, then be burnt in effigy, 'cause we make fun of archaeology. Welcome to another amazing, exciting episode of Goblinological Fantasies. It's me, your wonderful host, the mayor of Goblin Town himself, and I have a guest on with us today. It is Natasha Mikles, an assistant professor of religious studies in the Department of Philosophy at Texas State University, who is an officer in the International Association of Tibetan Studies, the co-chair of New Directions in the Study of Religion, Monsters, and the Monstrous, editor of the Journal of Gods and Monsters, coordinator, organizer, International Seminar of Young Tibetologists, and the organizer of Gods and Monsters Conference in 2018-2019. Okay, so there you go.
When you put it all out like that, I feel like I've done a lot more than it feels like I've done.
Well, I'm just really happy to have you here to talk to you here.
Mhm.
Um, and today we're going to talk about the hell and King Yama.
Woohoo!
Okay, so in that introduction, I mentioned a lot about Tibet,
Yes.
and I think when the interview or when the audience thinks of Tibet, they don't really think of hell. So, what
Mhm.
brought you to hell?
Um, well, uh, so what brought me to hell or what brought me to or kind of why don't people usually think of hell when they think of, Buddhism in Tibet?
Either one.
Um, so I always, I kinda wish I had a better narrative for how I fell into what I study. So I was raised Catholic, and, when I went to college, I think like a lot of young people, I said, "I'm not Catholic anymore, I'm a Buddhist." But I didn't really know what that meant. What it mostly meant for me when I was in college at William and Mary was I would meditate really ostentatiously in like public places. And then I would preface all these things by saying, like, well, as a Buddhist, I think we should get Chinese food or something. I then took an introduction to Buddhism course in my undergraduate and discovered that I was actually, in fact, not a Buddhist. So the whole we'll talk about this, but the whole no self thing kind of threw me for a bit of a loop there. But I became really interested in all the ways that I wasn't a Buddhist. And I lived in Buddhist monasteries in Japan for a semester through the Antioch Buddhist Studies in Japan Study Abroad program. And when I came back, we had just hired a new scholar of Buddhism to teach at William and Mary, and Kevin Vose, and he was a specialist in Tibet, and so you kind of imprint on the people who are important to you when you're an undergraduate. And so I became really interested in Tibet, and along the way discovered King Gesar, who is basically like the King Arthur of Tibet. And at some point discovered he went to hell, and so I got really excited about that. Um, I was a little bit of a kind of horror nerd and a little bit of a kind of budding heavy metal nerd, and so I thought, this is the most wonderful heavy metal thing that could possibly be. King Gesar goes to hell. So that's how I got into hell. I think a lot of times Americans don't think about hell in Buddhism. And I think this is because I think a lot of Americans want Buddhism to be something that it's not. They want to be the opposite of their often Christian upbringing, in some ways similar to my own story. So they kind of, I think, focus on some of the less gory, less grotesque parts of Buddhism. And so hell has not quite translated as much into American ideas of Buddhism.
It's kind of funny because I think here in America, I'm in California, right? I think it's funny that we think of the sort of stereotype of Christian fundamentalist as one who's like obsessed with hell and the devil. But when
Yes.
you look at like descriptions of hell from like the Buddhist like texts or stories, I'm like, they are so much more into it. I'm like,
Oh yeah.
wow.
Yeah, the best hells are in Buddhism. I talk about with my students. One of my favorites is called the Blue Lotus Hell, and it's like a very classical Indian Buddhist hell, and it's a cold hell, which Buddhism has traditionally about 8 cold hells and 8 hot hells, and so this is one of the cold hells, and it's this hell where you get blisters because it's so cold, and then the fluid inside the blister freezes, and because ice takes up more space than water, it actually causes the skin on top of the blister to burst open. And then when your skin's kind of all in tatters, burst open, it looks like an open flower on your skin. And so the blue lotus hell is where you're experiencing this, and it just looks like you're covered in blue lotuses all over your skin. It's like such a poetically beautiful, horrifyingly grotesque hell.
I mean, like, just visually, sort of in my mind, imagining that, like, that's really pretty and horrifying.
Yes.
Okay, so my question then is about the hells. Then is like, just how canonical are each of these hells? Because, like, in the Bible doesn't really describe hell very much. It's
Mhm,
just not really a big part of it. And most of I think a big part of the Western imagination of hell actually comes from, like, Dante's Inferno, of
mhm.
going down through those levels. That's not in the Bible. That's not really part of any, like, Christian doctrines per se. So where are Hindus and Buddhists getting their ideas of hell?
Um, yeah, I'm actually teaching right now my Hell Across Cultures class here at Texas State, and one of the we kind of have it organized around 8 different theses about hell, things that challenge the way most people think, and one of them is that hell is not where we think it is. As you point out, hell's not really talked about in the Bible, and a lot of times, especially in the New Testament, where they talk about hell, it's actually a translation of this word Gehenna, which was a trash heap. It seems that Jesus and the followers of the earliest Christian followers were probably believed in something called annihilation theory, which is the idea that after death you no longer exist until this kind of coming second coming or some kind of great resurrection at the end of time, and then you'll kind of pop back into existence. Hell has been a pretty classical part of Hinduism and Buddhism from some of its earliest texts. Um, so it's a place where you can be reborn into. Both Buddhism and Hinduism believe in the idea of the cycle of reincarnation, that this life is not your only life. That you're constantly cycling this thing called samsara, which is this realm of suffering, and you're constantly being reborn based on your karma or what actions you've done in your previous lifetimes. Now, Buddhism, which is what I'm most familiar with from my research, we do get descriptions of hell in early texts like the Abhidharmakosha, which is this kind of collection of philosophical teachings made by the early followers of the Buddha. And in the Devadatta Sutta, we get, which is one of our kind of earliest recordings of the teachings of the Buddha itself, we see a story, the Buddha relaying a story where a man dies and goes before King Yama, who is the Buddhist king of hell and the Hindu king of hell, goes before the Buddhist king of hell. And he basically kind of questions him, being like, "Did you not know that you were going to have to one day be accounted for your actions?" And of course, the man says no, and then he gets sent to hell and gets tortured. But those particular stories, they're not really quite well, the Abenaki Crush says there's the 8 hot and the 8 cold hells. It doesn't quite go into graphic detail. That mostly comes from other types of religious scriptures, things that might not be quite as what we say in religious studies canonical, or what I like to use the term like kind of institutionally written or institutionally approved. So these are more popular stories. These are stories of people who die and see hell, or kind of more imaginative and fantastical stories.
That's kind of also what I'm a little bit interested in, is that we're getting our religious ideas from a lot of places that are not from the institution.
Yes.
Just as a comparison, let's take the devil, you know,
Mhm.
and then I wrote down a bunch of examples here in my notes. We have, like, Paradise Lost, we have Neil Gaiman's Sandman, we have Dante's Inferno, but we also have, like, the movie Bedazzled, where the devil's a
Yes.
sexy woman, and then we have songs like "The Devil Went Down to Georgia." So it's like, which one are people taking, and where is that idea coming from?
Yeah, and that's something especially I think the devil's a great example of that. So many of our ideas about who the devil is just aren't do not exist in canonical in like the Old Testament Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. And even the New Testament, we can see what the kind of development of the idea of the devil during the Second Temple period. So this is the period where the ancient Israelites, and I just had to teach this, so it's all very fresh in my mind, but where they had come back from Babylonia and made a second temple, and we see a lot of oral literature around the devil. We see the kind of evidence of that in the New Testament in comparison to what our kind of earliest discussions of the devil were in kind of pre Second Temple literature. And especially you see this with contemporary horror movies. My colleague here, Dr. Laycock, Dr. Joseph Laycock, he has a book coming out called The Exorcist Effect about this kind of back and forth that happens between popular horror movies and religious experiences and practices. After The Exorcist came out in the early 70s, there was this explosion of people who said they need an exorcism. And the Catholic Church at that point had actually moved away from exorcism as a practice, and kind of found themselves suddenly flooded by people who said, I am possessed, I need an exorcism. And so I think a lot of times the things that we think we know and where we think we know them from are coming from movies, are coming from film, not or from other types of popular media like graphic novels, television shows, or folklore and legend, which were kind of the popular media of their day. It's coming from that, not from institutional religious literature.
For some people, it's a scary figure. You stay away from it. For other people, it's a symbol of transgression or subversiveness, right?
Yes.
Counterculture. Just for King Yama, like, what is he to like the people of Tibet?
So for most Buddhists, King Yama, he's the basically the representation of karma. And there's a little bit of tension because in this popular literature, popular Buddhist literature that we see in Tibet, China, and also in Japan, we see people, they die and they get judged by King Yama. In the Buddhist system, karma is not really something that like is a person. You don't they It doesn't judge you. It's an automatic thing. Um, so the idea that you have a judge who's going to decide where your rebirth is, it doesn't quite fully make sense. Um, However, he becomes this really interesting figure as I think a lot of people when they die, they want to know that they have some opportunity or some kind of ability to try and argue their case. And so I think that Yama takes on that role, though I've yet to ever read a text in which anyone like successfully argues with him. But he represents karma, and in a lot of texts, he's actually calls himself a Buddha. So he's an enlightened being in the Buddhist worldview, in the Buddhist mindset. If you have bad karma, you have to burn that off before you can be reborn in a place where you have good karma and can eventually attain enlightenment. So for Buddhists, they see hell as this temporary place that you have to go through in order to burn off your bad karma. And so we see examples of Yama saying, I'm sorry that I have to do this, but you need to go on to a better path of enlightenment. This is the only way to do that. And so in that way, he's very different than the devil. He is almost a helper to the Buddhist system. I mean, he is in many ways a representation of enlightened knowledge in some different texts. And that makes him very, very different than kind of more popular ideas of the Christian devil.
You wrote in an essay. Let me make sure I get the right essay. The
Yeah.
monsters and the moral King Yama's representation in returner literature.
Yeah.
I think you said that it's useful to call him a monster or call him monstrous. Okay, so first off, like, why would King Yama be considered monstrous?
Yeah. So I talk about in that essay, there's a bit of a backlash. Because when we're thinking about Yama, there's this. I think a lot of earlier scholars made this very simplistic, like, he is the Buddhist devil. They were trying to say everything that Christians have that make it a religion, other religions have. And so they said, Yama's the Buddhist devil. Well, he's not. He functions very, very differently. But at the same time that that was happening in academic scholarship of the late 19th and early 20th century, there was also this move among some people to say, well, here's why Christianity's right. Look at how horrifying all these other religions are. Look at these deities with, the heads of animals and too many arms, and their skin is blue. These are monsters. And so I think a lot of scholars of Buddhism reacted and said, no, these aren't monsters. These are not monstrous figures. And while of course I understand that impulse to protect the thing you study, um, I do think that by kind of focusing on Yama as a monster, we can talk about the fact that for a lot of Buddhists, he is very scary. In that, I'm thinking particularly of what's called Dailok literature or returner literature, is the kind of way I've chosen to translate this. This is a term in Tibetan. The day means to pass away, and lok means to return. So these are people in Tibet who have died, and they go to be judged by Yama, and they often get sent back with a message. And they are, when you read that, they're terrified to approach Yama. They talk about kind of his horrifying visage and all these like servants who have animal heads around him and how scared they are and how they're watching other people get judged. And there's lots of kind of tearful scenes of mothers crying about their children. And I think that we're losing something as academics. We're losing something very human when we don't acknowledge that for Tibetan Buddhists that are consuming this literature, it's Yama is a scary figure. And while I don't want to, you know, I don't want to say that Yama is a monster ontologically in all places and all times. By calling him a monster, by kind of focusing, using monster theory, which is this developing area in religious studies, to think about him, you can kind of remind yourself that he is scary while also being this figure of Buddhist enlightenment.
Like when I look at art, I'm gonna look at some pictures of him right now. It like he's black skinned, like three eyes. He's got horns, multiple like arms, claws. At least in some depictions of him. And so yeah, I mean, at least superficially, like that's kind of scary to me. But I think it's also like you're saying, like he's not monstrous to all times to all people because in my notes, I don't know if you're familiar with the animes that I put in the notes. It's a picture of King Yama from Dragon Ball, and also Hozuki's cool headedness, where he's basically just a bureaucrat sitting at a desk, like kind of kind of stressed out from his job.
That's really indebted to the Chinese and Japanese images of Yama, where he is, the Japanese and Chinese images of the underworld, or the Diyu, the like earth prison is what they call it, uh, is very bureaucratic. And a lot of scholars of Chinese religions have made a lot of hay about the fact that the Chinese afterlife in many ways mirrors the kind of imperial bureaucracy that existed in the this life in the present world. And so Yama is just one bureaucrat among 10 different bureaucrats you have to get through in order to like move into wherever you're going to go. And there actually are cases, there's some Chinese cases that are really interesting where someone dies and they go to be judged and the person's looking their form basically being like, oh, you just had the same name as someone who was supposed to die. You weren't supposed to die. That other person with the exact same name was supposed to die. Um, and then they don't know what to do because they can't send them back. So it's like, sorry. And that person usually wanders around as a ghost. So that's where some Chinese thing, or some Chinese folk series where ghosts come from.
That that's about as terrifying as everything else you've told me so far. um, but I think it's interesting, like the returner narrative that you described. It honestly, it kind of feels a little bit. Well, it's what is it? It's like near death experiences, or
Mhm.
if you talk about like aliens, it's kind of like abductees, right? Or it's it's touching the kind of the supernatural. It's like touching the divine almost. And then, but touching it is kind of it's life changing. It's terrifying, and it's really hard to conceive, I guess, as a mortal here on this material plane.
Yeah. And America actually does have, we have our first Tibetan returner, Tibetan Daylok. Sam Bercholz, who works with Shambhala Publishing. He was having heart surgery and died for several minutes while in the middle of heart surgery. And he was a practicing Tibetan Buddhist and he had his own vision of hell. And he actually worked with a Tibetan graphic artist to make a kind of graphic novel called A Guided Tour of Hell. Um, which is pretty, I mean, it's pretty cool that we now have our own set of returners.
um, I'm waiting for that section in the bookstore.
Yeah.
You mentioned monster studies.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm gonna blow past Jeffrey Cohen's 7 theses. I'm gonna go to your 5 theses.
Excellent.
I was really thinking about this for King Yama. Ostensibly he's monstrous. At least there are aspects of him that seem monstrous.
Mhm.
But the thing is, though, at the end, right, is he is maybe not enforcing, but he's part of that karmic system. That there's a
Yes.
certain moral structure to the universe. And so I really liked your thesis number 2, that monsters imply and paradoxically preserve categories, which is
Yes.
even though he himself, even if you're just talking about the superficial depictions of him, he's too big to be a human. He's too like ugly to be normal. He's like an animal or stuff like that. Like he breaks a lot of categories, but then he's also reinforcing that kind of good evil categorization. It's like if you're good, good things happen. If you're bad, bad things happen, and that's a much more structured. Maybe not. I'm doing it simplistically, but that's a much
Yeah.
more kind of like category or institution affirming idea. I think, and I that's an interesting paradox there.
Yeah, and, I think in some ways, when we were writing when, Dr. Laycock and I were writing that thesis, we were talking about the fact that it kinda works in 2 ways. Like, one, that just calling when you have kind of neat categories and then something doesn't fit in the category, by calling it a monster, you're kind of actually preserving your category because you don't ever have to be like, "Wait, maybe whatever box that I thought of needs to be expanded." You can just be like, "Oh, wait, no, it doesn't. That's just a monster that does have its own category." But also that, Yama's this kind of horrifying figure in a law of return, which the only person who's not scared in front of Yama is someone who knows they have nothing to fear, who has done all the right things, given money to all the monks, done every ritual you need to do, taken the vows that they needed to take. And so to them, it's like Yama's just like a stop along the way while they move on to the next thing. And so in that way, it's by having Yama be so monstrous, it's sort of saying, you should want to not be like this. You should want to get out of hell and to go towards your own Buddhist practice, your own eventual enlightenment.
As you were saying in Chinese versions of it, that King Yama is kind of set to sort of judge or at least process souls on their way to the afterlife. And I was thinking, like, you know what? This doesn't really sound like the devil. It sounds more like Saint Peter at the pearly gates. So, do you think that like, that's an appropriate comparison, or what? What do you think is a better way of kind of understanding or comparing King Yama?
Yeah, I think a lot of times religion scholars are very nervous about comparison, because I think it's very easy to make very bad comparisons, like you point out with being like, well, Yama's like the devil. I've written an article called like the seven deadly sins of religious studies, looking at how, especially beginning students who just start studying religion, kind of some of the logical fallacies they fall into, or some of the intellectual traps. And one that I talk about is called square peg round hole, which is the idea where they're like, okay, you a religion, often Christianity, and often or whatever the student's home religion is, or the religion they grew up in, becomes the model, and then they just try to find all the pieces. So, the example I always use with students is they might be like, okay, instead of a church, Muslims go to a mosque. Instead of Jesus, Muslims have Muhammad. But of course, Jesus and Muhammad are very different figures in their religious traditions. Muhammad's a prophet, and he is the voice through which God comes into the world, but he is not in any shape or form considered to be equal to God in the way that Jesus is in Christianity.
I was about to say, like, it's a very, very different comparison.
Exactly. And so Stephen Prothero, who is a scholar of religious literacy, has said that really, in many ways, Muhammad is much more like Mary, because he is it. Muhammad is the vehicle that God comes into the world through, or through which God comes into the world. And so I think in many ways, thinking about Yama as much closer to St. Peter in front of the pearly gates really does fit closer to kind of what Yama does in Buddhist traditions. Uh, Now, I would say the one kind of big difference is that, especially in the Chinese tradition, there are ways to there's different rituals you can do to appease Yama. So in the Chinese tradition, there's something called the Scripture on the Ten Kings. This is an apocryphal scripture, so it's written in China. It claims to be Indian, but it's actually not. And um, Stephen Tizer is a scholar of Chinese Buddhism who has argued that most people using this text in China knew it wasn't from India, even though it claims to, but just didn't care. Uh, and in the text, it says there's 10 kings. Your loved one dies. They're going to go through the courts of these 10 kings over 3 years. And if you want to help them, make sure they have a good rebirth. Here's all the different rituals you can do on what day after they died when they're going to be in that court. And so Yama's one of the many kings in that court. And it's interesting because it kind of contradicts a little bit classical Buddhist ideas that it's your karma that's going to determine where your reborn is. Now you kind of can have like a support team that's on the side of the living that can do rituals and give money to monks on certain days so that you will make sure that you have a good rebirth. But I think that humans are always kind of looking for a way out. They know what they're supposed to do, and they don't want to have to do it. And so, uh, yeah.
So much of Chinese like culture is about the relationship between the parent and the child,
Hmm.
and that extends even beyond death, into the afterlife. That you're still supporting your parents, with
Yes.
the burning of offerings and things like that. So I think that's that very much fits in there, and I think that's kind of funny that because you see this a lot as a religion is moving into a different country, a different people, a different culture, it has to kind of adjust and kind of wriggle and contort to fit this new situation. And so that's
Yeah.
kind of an interesting example of that.
Yeah. My husband and I have a big party every year for the Ghost Festival. Usually sometime around mid to late August. And we do a performance of Mulian saving his mother in hell. And he is this Buddhist monk. His Sanskrit name is Modgaliana. And in the kind of Chinese stories about him, um, his mother dies and she had lied and had not been a very good Buddhist. And so she gets reborn in hell, and he, after becoming a Buddhist monk, of course only after his parents die so that he can be a good Confucian son and take care of them into the point they die, he then has to go to hell to save her. And scholars have written about this as exactly um, Buddhism knowing what is non-negotiable. And I shouldn't say Buddhism because Buddhism is a tradition, it can't do anything, but Buddhist missionaries in China knowing what is non-negotiable. So filial piety is non-negotiable, but trying to kind of turn it so that the Buddhist monks have inserted themselves into the tradition of filial piety. So now, at the end of the end of the play, the Buddha does come. He destroys hell, and he says, "If you want to make sure your loved ones, won't be born in hell or won't suffer in hell, on the 15th day of the seventh month, you can provide offerings to the Buddhist monks when they finish." Their summer retreat, or their kind of summer retreat in the rain. And so it's like the monks who are, uh, at least in the ideal sense, men who do not have families, and do not have children themselves and have kind of given up their family ties, have just inserted themselves into everyone else's family relationship and said, now you have to give us food and offerings in order to save your relatives in hell.
I think we kind of, at least here in America, we kind of criticize some of the mega churches because, like,
Hmm.
oh, this preacher is like receiving all this money, like dressing really nicely, having this big nice church. But if anyone has been to some of the monasteries or like temples in China and stuff, they're pretty big, they're pretty shiny, and I'm like, the money has had to come from somewhere. So it's kind of funny that our idea is like a Buddhist monk is something who's like rejected all material wealth, but then the temple is like worth a whole lot of
Yes.
money.
Yeah, and in contemporary Thailand, there's been a lot of criticism because some monks there have like private jets and they like fly around. And there's been some criticism from some commentators that, like, wait a second, this is kind of getting out of line. And so there is debate within, like, Buddhists realize this, and there's debate within the tradition about it. Um, but just like in America, we still have wealthy mega churches, and same thing in Asia.
Okay, you talked about Mulian going back to
Mhm.
save his mother. King Gaesar also saves his mother, doesn't he?
He does. So, the text that my dissertation was based on, that I'm currently working on a book about, in Tibetan, it's called the Nyeling Dzogpa Chempo. So I've translated that as uh, King Gaesar's great perfection of hell, or great perfecting of hell. Um, and it's part of the Gaesar epic is this larger oral epic tradition. It's what's considered a living epic, meaning that new episodes are still revealed, usually by bards in a form of spirit possession, where they will enter a state where they get possessed either by the epic itself or by the characters in the epic, and they will kind of often have a vision of story and start reciting it in this trance-like state. Um, and the text that I've translated is you might call a literary episode. So uh, this is a written episode that then has secondary orality, meaning that it was written down and now bards do perform it in that kind of form state of possession. But It was originally a literary episode. And it's possible, of course, that bards, before it was written down, did perform it orally, but we just don't have record of that, so we don't know. It claims to be the final episode, though. This is where King Gesar um, descends to hell and he saves his mother. Very similar, as you point out, to Mulien. And there was possible that there's some connection there. It's a little bit unclear. And during that has this basically epic rap battle with King Yama, or kind of a song battle, where the two kings sing these songs to each other, each trying to justify their actions. And essentially, Yama wins. Yama wins at the moment that Gesar is saying that his mother was a good Buddhist, she shouldn't be in hell, and then Gesar says that. Then Yama comes back and says, yes, she was a good Buddhist, but you have not been a good Buddhist. You've been this great king. You've been killing people. And then, Gesar kind of retorts, like, I'm doing this to save Buddhism in Tibet. These are horrible demonic kings. And he says, I am this great, powerful demon slayer. But it's okay because I have tantric powers that when people die, I send their souls to a pure land. So really, it's great for everyone. You might die on this land, on this plane, but in the next life, you will immediately become a Buddha. Perfect. And then Yama just says, no, you don't. Like, you've been lying this whole time. And actually, in the text, his mother's at the bottom of the kind of pit of hell, surrounded by all the men he's ever killed in battle. So Gesar has a lot of work to do to kind of get everyone out because he has to save everyone.
I mean, that sounds really poetic. That does sound a little
Yeah.
bit like Dante. Like, okay, like, I mean, Dante's Inferno was really a lot about him kind of in axe to grind against his political prisoners. So he did a lot of like
Yes.
political or poetic punishments of his enemies, and so that's kind of interesting. The I guess karmic. I guess that is an example of karma where his actions end up like boomeranging and injuring the ones he loves.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's like kind of turning karma on its head, in a way that, again, institutional Buddhism says your karma is your karma alone. There's nothing, that is what earliest Buddhist texts say. That is what, I think kind of we might say like the most traditional form of Buddhist ethics says that. But then we actually see in the way that religions lived, and the way that's actually practiced, like in China, where your family's doing all sorts of stuff while they're still alive to get you out of hell and to kind of make sure that you don't suffer in hell. At the lived level, Gesar's mother suffers for his bad karma. And that shouldn't be the case from just a plain sense reading of Buddhist karma, but at a lived level, that's the way that these Buddhists are thinking about it.
Also, in your essay, you described a lot of other paradoxes or contradictions, right? If the mother was a good person, then she shouldn't have been there.
We also see it's kind of, there's this at like even further level, because I've done a lot of field work in Tibet, and when I was doing field work on the Nyelling, on Gesar's journey to hell, I would ask people, well, why is Gesar's mother in hell? I thought she was a good Buddhist. And no one gave the reason that's in the text. Everyone gave some explanation for why she actually wasn't a good Buddhist. They would say that she took delight and joy in Gesar's victories where he killed other people, or that she had doubts about the truth of Buddhism at the end of her life. They would have all these explanations that are nowhere in the text at all, but again, this is their living interpretation. And for Tibetans today, like Gesar, especially Tibetans living in Eastern Tibet or West China, um, Gesar Gesar is a Buddhist figure. Gesar can't make mistakes. Like, that is more important than following what the text says. Remember I even pointed out to someone, like, in the text, I'm like, but it says here this, and they said, oh, that's a mistake. That's a misprinting. The whole text, like, which I think actually ties back to what we were talking about earlier, where I think there's this idea that a lot of people have that to understand a religion, I just need to go read their holy scripture, their Bible, their Quran, their Torah, and then I'll understand the religion. And that's just not the case. Like, religions often have very little to do with their holy scriptures, or they or religions will say, yes, that's what's in our sutra, or that's what's in our canon, and you go look and you're like, that's not there. But everyone kind of thinks about that. Another example I was thinking of based on what we were talking about earlier, is all these ideas people have about the end of the world. Um, and they say are like in the book of Revelations that like the Antichrist will be this very powerful political figure who will be the child of a diplomat. None of that's in the book of Revelations. That's all comes in the movie The Omen. So, um, but that was such an important and powerful movie for shaping religious consciousness that now people will believe that, and just assume, well, obviously that's in the book of Revelations, which if you ever, I'm sorry, if you ever watch The Omen, like there's a section in it where someone says, oh, and this was foretold in the book of Revelations, and then gives this rhyming poem that is nowhere in Revelations. And, was literally written by a Jewish director who just thought, "Well, this sounds like a cool little poem." And I've heard from people who've kind of done work on this that this director has kind of been horrified to know that the like little poem and the little ideas that he wrote have become just sort of part of the zeitgeist of contemporary Christian fundamentalism.
That's probably the most horrifying thing
I know.
we've had in this conversation. I guess the last thing I want to think about is when Christians look at figures like Yama, they're like, or they look at any of those other religions, they're like, okay, that's monsters, that's the devil, they just all lump it together in sort of religious other. I'm wondering what do like Tibetans think about the Christian devil or any other sort of situation where someone in their own culture is looking out over at that other figure and they're like, that's a monster.
So it's interesting because I was thinking in some ways, what I think is very interesting about that question is that it kind of assumes that they are doing that. Um,
Ah.
the academic study of religion or kind of religious studies has its roots in European, and I say Euro American, but really European um, ideas of colonization. That we didn't really even have a word for religion until uh, about the 18th century or 19th century when suddenly these European powers were colonizing other people, and they realized some people began to think like, wait, they have something that kind of looks like what we have. There must be some larger category. It's not just Christianity and Islam. There's something larger category, and then they use this word religion. Religion used to just mean like your oath or your kind of the vows you had taken or the kind of the organization to which you belonged as a monk or a priest. Um, and so what this means is that it has almost always been Christians looking at other people who, for various reasons, they had a power imbalance over and saying, ah, yes, your religion is this way, your religion is that way. Um, and I think it's where we get the idea of like good gods and bad gods is that we think of gods as some kind of category that is above and beyond just Yahweh or Allah or Yama or Jehovah or something like that. So I'm trying to think. I've never heard any kind of I've never been present while Tibetan Buddhists were analyzing Christianity in the way that we analyze Buddhism.
Hmm.
Um, I think because there's still that kind of historic power imbalance there.
Yeah, I guess the only example I can think of that comes to my head is when maybe Jews are talking about the Eucharist and talking about communion, and they're like, "That's cannibalism. That's terrifying." And I'm like,
Yes.
I'm like, "Yeah, but it's supposed to be symbolic."
But then what's
um,
also really interesting about that is it kind of gets inverted then when you look at like anti-Semitic tropes, where they're like, well, gosh, I can't think of the word for it.
you think blood libel?
Blood libel, yes, there it is, exactly. When they're like, "Oh, we have to," when during the Middle Ages, they would say, "Well, the Jews need the blood of Christian infants to make their challah bread," and so if any Christian child went missing, they were like, "Ah, yes, the Jews have eaten the child," which is just so ironic. The people who were believed they were eating flesh and drinking blood were the Christians in the church.
and and if anybody knows the rules of kosher, you're not supposed to eat the blood. You're supposed to specifically not eat blood.
Exactly.
So it's like on multiple levels. It's like, what are you doing?
And I do think this kind of circles back to what you were talking about earlier, this idea of monstrosity and kind of where when we call things a monster. I've just been reading Esther Hamori's recent book called God's Monsters, and in her last chapter, she talks about God as a monster in the Hebrew Bible, and that she compares this to the very famous interview that Robert Nixon gave with the journalist Frost, where he implies if a president does something, it's not illegal. And she says that a lot of times when Jews and Christians are confronted by areas in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament where God is acting like a monster, they say, well, he can't be a monster, he's God. And she said, well, but we should actually say it like it is. Like, God acts very monstrous. And if we look at kind of a plain sense reading of the text, God is much more. It seems like the ancient Israelites, when they were writing their literature, cared a lot more about powerful gods than they did about good gods. So the idea that this God is good or bad is not something that would actually even enter their brain. It's how powerful is that God? We want to get under the umbrella of the most powerful God.
That's a really interesting idea. Um,
Yeah.
part of the impetus for this interview was I have to. Okay, so this is D&D, right? This is
Mhm.
D&D talking. At least in fifth edition, because that's the edition that's currently out right now. Fifth edition
Mhm.
of Volo's Guide to Monsters. It actually talks about goblins, specifically goblins that they every once in a while they form a war horde, and then that's basically the the thing that you see in like movies or comics or whatever, that the goblins just go out and raid and pillage all over the place. It's this sort of expression of them of their worship of Maglubiet, which is in like D&D lore, that's the head goblin god.
Yeah.
And I was thinking like because for Goblin Town I have to make a relationship for the goblins and Maglubiet, and I think that's interesting right there that they're not concerned with being good or bad, they're concerned with power. And that's an interesting paradigm shift, I think, sort of moving, well, in pop culture in this case, but also like in other instances.
Well, I know that uh that D&D has also been kind of moving to not saying there's good and bad races. That um the idea that like the orcs are always brutish and nasty and is just not a useful idea.
Well, I okay, this is going to be a whole other topic.
Yeah.
This is going to be another interview with somebody. I don't know who I'm going to interview, but the thing is, though, D&D. This is me on my own little soapbox. But D&D comes out of the wargaming tradition, so the whole point was to simulate wars. So creating evil races was just a kind of backdoor, like circular, like we have to kill something. Okay, we'll
Yeah.
just make up this dummy kind of thing and call it evil. But that carried further on, and now we're much less interested in the wargaming aspect and much more the role playing aspect, the narrative aspect, and that doesn't make as much sense anymore. For me, I actually enjoy some of the
Yeah.
like the racial bonuses or negatives or like calling the race evil or whatever,
Yeah.
just because I like doing the wargaming aspect. But I think anyone who's seen me like make my Goblin Town, I'm not that interested in that for my narrative, or for building my narratives. It's just not interesting. It's not useful. It's boring.
Well, I think a lot of this also it might be a divide between like newer gamers and like older gamers or gamers who are more versed in sort of the history of Dungeons and Dragons. In one of my campaigns I'm in right now, I've created this new race of dwarfs that are like spider dwarfs. They're a variant of a mountain dwarf.
Ooh.
And I based it. There's this kind of popular legend in Muslim countries that generations before Muhammad was born, his family line was threatened with attack, and they hid in a cave. And Allah knew that Muhammad was going to be born from this line, so he commanded a spider to build their web over the front of the cave, so that when the people searching for Muhammad's family or Muhammad's like ancestors came by to find it, that they would see the spider web and be like, well, no one's come through here, else they would have disturbed the spider web, and they go on. And so I've taken that as an inspiration for this whole race of dwarves, or this whole tribe of dwarves who, somewhere back in their ancient past, um, were threatened, and a spider saved them in the same way. And so now they all worship Lolth, the spider goddess, and they think that the dark elves are great heretics. And the character I'm playing is this druid of the spider goddess, and mostly I just want to turn into a spider at any opportunity. Um, so, but it's interesting because I've been working workshopping this character, and my husband has played Dungeons and Dragons like from his high school, and he's in his 40s, and he keeps being like, this is. he's like, "You can do this. This is very strange." It's like Lolth is cannot be like you're not supposed to worship Lolth. I'm like, "Why not?" Like, I think that the Dark Elves have Lolth all wrong, and I'm like, and it's we constantly kind of have this tension because I didn't start playing Dungeons and Dragons till about 5 years ago, and he is this kind of larger shared history that I am not privy to, and I never had to experience.
I'm a little bit of an older style player, or at least I'm acquainted with it. I'm acquainted with that relationship of the DM being antagonistic to the players and trying to actively kill them. I only mildly enjoy it, mildly. But you said that you're a little bit of a newer player to D&D, and right, they have a little bit of a different relationship. So for you, how would you plot to kill the players?
I think that's a really good question. I'm trying to think. Um, so uh, I really like kind of plot devices where you have to be. I'm trying to think, I don't know what to call it, but like we have to be like really. We have to tell your players something like really specific, and if they don't do it that way, they die. So like the one time I DM'd and I ran a 3-shot based on Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose, and it was this murder mystery. And spoiler alert for those who haven't read Name of the Rose, the murder item is a book, and someone has poisoned the edges of a page of a book. And so if you touch the book and then lick your finger to turn the page, you've poisoned yourself. And I used, I can't remember the name of the poison, but like it's the one that you die at midnight. So you could have been poisoned at like 11 a.m. and not known it and then died at midnight. And I had a lot of fun with my players when they would handle the murder weapon, not realizing the murder weapon, and kind of just sort of being like, and how do you pick it up? And what do you do with that? Like, kind of like, and so I think like, I don't know. I think it's fun to find ways to kill players where they have to be careful with items and they don't realize it, like everyday items, like a book, or in that particular campaign, they found the bottle that had the poison, and and I had to be like, how are you picking it up? Um, and if I was a better DM, I'd find something like sneaky way to be like, how'd you pick it up, so that they don't. Because I think as soon as I asked how you picked it up, they immediately were like, something's weird about this bottle. It's not a regular bottle. But I think that kind of stuff is really fun, where players just assume they can do anything in the world and it won't hurt them, and be like, no, there are things in the world that really can't hurt you.
that that's absolutely devilish. I love it, and it's so ripe to make the players like paranoid about everything.
Yes. Yeah, if you just did it for like 30 minutes with like every single item they're touching, just like regular items, by the end of it, they've like gone crazy.
Now we're going to come to the last question. So
Yeah.
hard hitting question. Are you ready?
Yes.
You're an assistant professor at Texas State University. You love your students.
Theoretically.
If you were King Yama,
Okay.
hell would you prepare for the students that are less than exemplary?
Ooh. Oh, that's hard because the students have been a little whiny recently. And I think I've given them 10 points of extra credit, but some of them they didn't get done in time, and they are whining at me. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I could do like an ironic hell where like their whines like turn back on them somehow. Um, but I feel like that might not quite have the same punch to it. Actually, I actually there's a hell. I can think about this. There's actually, and it's not. I'm totally wimping out here because it's not even my idea. But this is a hell that I've seen depicted in a manuscript in Tibet. And the picture that I saw was this painting of a monk, and he has these books that have fallen on him, and the books are as big as he is, and they're crushing him, and his little eyeballs have popped out, and like just the art is like so perfectly like you could like just like little doodles of eyeballs being squashed. And so I think that I would have them go to that hell, and all the readings they have not done during this semester that they pretended to do have become huge and just crush them. And I think that so that way, if they were good students and did all the readings, then there's nothing there to then they're totally safe. But if they were a bad student and have done none of the readings, then the readings would all crush them.
That is perfect. That Dr. Michaels, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. It was an enjoyment and honor to have you on here.
Well,
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much. So
Well, thank you
do
so much. This has been great.
dinosaurs. Yes, we also do dinosaurs. Still hoping to find buried gold. Yes, we also do dinosaurs.